Yes, quite a lot of me. Actually, I'm for a competition.
Jeg har også arbejdet faktisk indtil for et år siden, bare som studentermedhjælp.
No, I think that's what keeps me away from having a total stress breakdown.
Jeg har været
2 or 3 times a week, just
indmeldelse og
nothing else but
erstatning.
So Patrick, try and see if you can get access to the stream.
Yeah, to see it. He's not going to get into Eduroam, so.
You can't get into Eduroam. Okay. Somebody else has got
You can jump on my phone. That's why I passed you on.
No, but just check if the stream is.
Yeah. It's just why on earth is the picture mirror flipped? Does anybody know why that happened? Why it's mirror reversed? So I get sort of this thing can't be read. Why is that?
I have no idea. Perhaps because it's a webcam, so.
So it's designed to do that?
Maybe. It does indeed.
It's a little bit weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
That is super strange.
How?
So we need a mirror.
Yeah, we will need a mirror.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Basically, we should sort of record the mirror, but why does it do that?
But can we? If we record it now, then we can probably.
We can flip it later.
We can flip it later, can't we?
But this.
And then you get more viewers.
Yeah.
I mean, are you going to share a link that we can share?
We'll test whether the link actually works before we share something that you can share. I think that's what I wanted Patrick to do. Webcam stream mirror.
That is super weird. Vent, og skal vi ikke bare kaste os ud i det her med omvendt skærm, og så flippe den bagefter, eller hvad?
Har du streamen åben der, eller hvad?
Ja.
Hvordan,
den laver det samme her.
Ja, så er der det der problem med...
Nej, det ser rigtigt ud her på sådan. Nu ser det rigtigt ud. Her ser den rigtig ud. Så det er åbenbart på din skærm.
Okay. Wow.
Okay.
Look. That's my left arm, right arm. Yeah. I did set it to super low latency, but I think it's got a latency of about 4 seconds. So
Okay. So if we do you pass
Dr. Jess, your creative PT. Jamen, så fint at se jer.
Så super godt.
Det er som Jessica kan se, hvad vi laver.
Godt nok, der er sådan en top chat ved siden af her.
Ja.
Okay, men skal vi så ikke bare gå i gang?
Jo.
And there is our final speaker, which is quite perfect because this leaves me 2 minutes of welcome, which is what I think a proper welcome should be. So I'm not going to talk for ages in my sort of welcoming speak. I'm happy to see some people. I thought there would be no one but the presenters. So it's really nice to see that some more people are actually present physically to hear about a bit about the chapters of this book that we are launching today. But we are actually not the only ones taking part in this book launch because we have a small audience on YouTube as well. On popular request at Facebook, we have decided to live stream the presentation so that people in other parts of the country can follow us. So this is one service information, and there are more people in here who will also be able to hear your questions if you ask any questions during this event. Another service information is that some of these presentations I suspect will be in English and others will be in Danish. I think, Anne, you prefer to present.
Yeah, but I actually done it in English.
You're going to do it in English? Okay, fine. Everything is going to be in English, which is fine for those of us who do not speak Danish then. So what we are presenting today is an anthology that has been, underway for quite a while. It's you might say the first scientific publications that we have made based on a research project that started up in the summer 2014, which is based on a general survey, a follow-up interview study, and a couple of focus groups focusing on Danish youth aged 10 to 18 and their gameplay patterns at a general level, and more specifically in relation to the degree to which they're doing well or unwell in their everyday settings. So the attempt, or the initial ambition with this book was to try and see if we quit this terrible term, video game addiction, but do address the fact that now and then problems and conflicts seem to appear around video games in everyday life. What do we get if we take a sociological perspective on some of these issues? This was our initial questions, and some of the presentations today will address this question more directly on the basis of the data that we have collected. This is I who is going to make a presentation on problem gaming as a broken life strategy. Andreas, who is going to focus on problem gaming as a question of institutional role conflict, and Anna, who is going to focus on problem gaming as a generation conflict, basically. So those three chapters are direct products of this research project that we initiated in the summer 2014. But apart from that, we have invited other authors as well into this anthology, including of which two are present here today. One is Rune Lundedal, who is going to discuss, as the first presenter, the very genealogy of video game addiction. Where does this term actually come from? And Patrick Brax, who is going to end the event with his presentation on problem gaming from the perspective of treatment. So in that way, what we are going to today is to take 5 alternative takes on this concept of video game addiction to discuss what lies underneath this discourse. So I refrain from calling it a phenomenon because it's not one phenomenon, it's several phenomena. But so this is what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully later on you will be here to share a glass of cava with us and congratulate each other for this fabulous publication. So, but I will let Rune take the floor to begin with.
Okay, so what I do in my chapter is try to look at the genealogy of video game addiction as it appears now. And I struggled a lot with trying to find out what term should I use for what it is that I'm doing. You could also say that I try to unravel the concept or dig into the roots, or there are different ways I could have phrased this. But I think genealogy is fitting because of the multiple meanings it has. On the one hand, it means the medical study of family histories. And on the other hand, it refers to the philosophical investigation of social beliefs that are otherwise taken for granted and not questioned. So that's my point of departure. And and as the subtitle mentioned, it's going to be a very critical account, because I do believe whenever we introduce new mental health disorders in our official handbooks, we need to exert extreme caution. And I think that's evident in some of the diagnoses that we've had earlier that we've now taken out of our handbooks, because we figured out that actually maybe homosexuality is less of a mental disease, and the disease category was used to browbeat people who were different than the majority. So my basic question actually stems from the fact that the APA writes in their definition of the proposed disorder that evidence mostly comes from prevalence studies. So we mostly know that video game addiction is a thing because of these large-scale questionnaire studies. And so my question is, but how can we know what it is that we're measuring if we don't do interviews, but only do questionnaire studies? And in order to meaningfully talk about addiction, I think we need to talk about what the term actually means. And you could somewhat coarsely say that there's like two separate meanings. One is the medical meaning, where addiction is a primary chronic disease. This means that, it's not just a symptom of something else, it is the primary disorder. And it's chronic, meaning that you don't ever recover. Once you have, acquired this disease, you will live with the changes that it brings forever. And so it builds on, it causes dysfunction, and it's perhaps also caused by dysfunction in brain circuitry. But addiction can also be used the way I think it's used mostly in our society. It can be used as something positive. So apparently the Latin root adico, or however it's pronounced, could mean something very positive, to give oneself over in the service of something greater, like the Senate, for example. It might also be something negative in the sense that you give yourself over in slavery, for example. So there's these two terms where one is only negative and the other one can be either negative or positive. And so in my investigation of this term, I of course referred primarily to the medical one, because it would not make sense to oppose this other one, I guess. Yeah, and so my chapter tries to do two things at once, and perhaps that's also why it was so difficult to write. I try to follow the trajectory of the theoretical basis of how are these questionnaires, what are the science on which these questionnaires are built, why do we know how to ask questions about addiction, and also I try to follow the diagnosis itself and what it builds on and how it's traveled from the west to the east and back again. So that's what I'm going to try to do in this very short presentation. I know it's going to seem a little superficial because it's going to be so fast and short, but anyone who's kind of interested should go read the chapter to see that I'm not just, pulling stuff out of my sleeves. So if we look at the theory first, then it has been proposed that addictions can be either positive, negative, or mixed blessing addictions. And Glasser wrote a book about positive addictions which was published back in 1976, where he argues that there are many things that one can be addicted to. It's not just drugs. It could also be other stuff, and that stuff could be positive in the sense of exercise, for example. Exercise or running might be a positive addiction that people have. And he sets out criteria for a positive addictions. Then in the 90s, Brown builds on this concept, and he argues that addiction, there's a typo, should be a value-free concept. So addiction shouldn't be used as a term that only denotes negative. It could also denote something positive. And he actually writes that gaming and simulation might be a mixed blessing addiction, because he acknowledges that there might be some negative consequences, but probably they're outweighed by good consequences or positive consequences. And he actually builds on research that sees addictive behavior as something much bigger than we normally do. So something that could be an addiction is talking just for the sake of talking. It could be eating spicy food, salty food, lying just for the sake of lying, even committing criminal acts can be seen in this framework as an addiction. So this is like a giant, or this broadens the scope of what can be considered addictions. And I think it's interesting that the components that Brown identifies for addictions are the ones that we now build addiction questionnaires on, especially because he says that they can be positive and negative. So building a medical diagnosis on this framework, I argue in my chapter, is flawed, or at least something that we need to be extremely careful when doing. And in the chapter, I try to draw a diagram, because I'm talking about all of this research, and primarily Scandinavian research because of where the book is situated. But so I try to show how addiction as a value-free concept is used by these researchers down here, but then it gets referenced in other research, and this might even have been like a gray area where it's unclear if addictions are always negative or not. And then it's used up here by the researchers that have been very influential for the disorder as it's been proposed by the APA in the DSM-5. And so what I try to show is that somewhere along the way, there's a shift where addiction is no longer a value-free concept, but is a pathological condition. And I hope that I, in my chapter, argue for why this might be a problem. The second strand that runs through the chapter is when I try to trace the diagnosis itself. And I begin by looking at how gambling became a disorder in the DSM. Back then it wasn't an addictive disorder. Back then it was impulse control disorder. So it was something different, but it has morphed into now being an addictive disorder. And so I tried to figure out what the DSM, the American Handbook, builds a disorder on, and I traced it back through other publications to where they say that it's basically based on this Chinese study called Proposed Diagnostic Criteria for Internet Addiction. So here's something interesting, that game addiction or internet gaming disorder is built on internet addiction, because the DSM-5 does not recognize internet addiction as a thing the way it does, or it proposed to do with games. And so the Chinese study says that internet addiction has 3 subtypes. One is excessive gaming, one is sexual preoccupations, and the last one is communications, like emailing and texting. And so what I point out in my chapter is the somewhat counterintuitive, or the at least unexplained. So I point out how it's problematic that it's not explained why we only import, or in the West, we only import the part about gaming and leave out the other stuff. And I think it is problematic that the APA in the DSM-5 considers game addiction to be just another word for internet addiction and vice versa, because the internet and video games do seem to be different things. Yes, and so I stumbled on something interesting in that the Chinese study mentions that, and this is a direct quote, that New York psychiatrist Ivan Goldberg first proposed in 1995 that internet addiction may be considered a disorder. And so I tried to track down where this comes from, and what I found was that in an interview with the New Yorker, Goldberg is cited as to saying that to medicalize every behavior by putting it into psychiatric nomenclature is ridiculous. If you expand the concept of addiction to include everything people can overdo, then you must talk about people being addicted to books, which most people would find ridiculous, of course. And this, of course, seems to contradict each other. And I stumbled on another quote, and I'm not sure how reliable it is, but it says that that apparently Dr. Goldberg had a somewhat dry sense of humor and was prone to use irony. And when he proposed that internet addiction was a new disorder, he did that as a way of critiquing the ever-expanding diagnostic handbook that is the DSM, and how it continues to grow and grow and grow, and more and more ordinary everyday things become mental diseases. And so he says in this quote that support group for internet addiction makes about as much sense as support groups for coughing. So I thought that was something extremely interesting and worth documenting in an academic publication. At the same time, in the 90s, a psychologist called Kimberly Young also made or formulated a new disorder. It wasn't in the DSM, but based on the DSM, she also created a diagnosis called internet addiction. But she didn't do it as a joke. She did it to be able to explain why so many people were seemingly, using the internet at the expense of their marriage and stuff like that. And so what I do in my chapter is I try to, draw a map of how DSM criteria for pathological gambling, what is called ludomania in Denmark, inspired Goldberg to make a joke, and Kimberly Young to create a diagnosis. And the Chinese study that is the basis for the current proposal in the DSM-5 actually references both. And I included some Scandinavian research because that also builds on Young's concept and also is referenced in the Chinese study. So at the end, what I end up with is this very large and complicated mess of a diagram of how these different strands interweave. So we have the theoretical stuff in the bottom and how that has moved and now influenced the proposal of internet gaming disorder. And from the top, we have how the disorder has traveled from the west to the east and now back again. And so on the basis of all this teasing out of different strands, I end up concluding that we can't actually be sure what game addiction scales measure because of where it all comes from, unless we actually do interviews and qualitative research. it is problematic that the theoretical underpinnings of the disorder derive from works that see addiction as something that can be either positive, negative, or somewhere in the middle. And it is problematic to build a concept of mental disorders on these ambivalent features. Yeah, and so I think I've shown in this chapter that even though much research literature says that internet addiction and its negative consequences are well documented, I hope that I've shown that it may not be because what these studies are measuring is addiction. It might be something else. And some of the stuff I go into is that we need to validate these questionnaires in different ways than just seeing if a high score in internet addiction also correlates with problems in life, because the fact that these two would correlate does not necessarily say that, or it's not necessarily true that one causes the other. It may be that they're caused by something else entirely. And so what we're measuring may not be addiction. It may be something else. And what that something else may be, I'll leave up to the rest of the authors from the book to kind of give their best guess at. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Do we take questions now or after?
If there are a few clarifying questions, you can ask them now. Otherwise, we do have some time for discussions later on.
Great. Thank you.
Any questions?
Well, I have actually
You have
one.
Yeah.
About where is Griffith in all your reflections?
Yeah, so he's actually very important because he's the one who, in a letter to in Nature, which is a very prestigious publication, he's the one that's kind of the bridge, along with Gentile, that uses the components defined down here as something that you could build a disorder or an addiction on. And so, yeah, he's super important.
Other questions? No, then I think we will continue with my presentation. I'll go for the big this one. Well, yes, and actually when I looked at the program this morning, I realized that it probably would have been smarter to have Anna and Andreas presenting before me, because I'm going to refer a lot to their chapters, but then, I can function as some sort of teaser, so that you can really, really look forward to hearing what more Andreas and Anna have to say about the stuff I'm presenting here. For some reason, this does not. So. Some problems with the screen. No, I think it went into sleep mode somehow. So I had to restart it to, yes. So now I think I can prompt it into, yes. Now it should appear, hopefully. I don't get that. Have you tried that, Andreas? It usually works, this one.
Yeah, that's why I didn't do a PowerPoint myself. No.
It went into sleep mode for some reason. Now it's on, but it doesn't seem to.
It doesn't really respond though. Yeah.
Respond here. Oh yes, could you see? Oh yeah, it's set for HDMI. That's why. Could you set it for PC, ordinary PC input? Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes it. So, but colors are horrible in this one. I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
So if I had a laptop with HDMI, I would have brought that, but I don't. I have a very old one here. What I'm going to talk about now is problem gaming as a question of broken life strategies. So that is, now that we have sort of, at least to some degree, done away with this concept of video game addiction, why is it then that parents keep complaining about their youngsters playing too much? So why is it that they keep having conflicts and problems about this out in the homes? And what I'm going to present here is one possible perspective on that. Anna and Andreas are going to give some other perspectives on that. But first of all, why the concept problem gaming? Can we, on the basis of what Rune just said, say, well, let's just accept that gaming is part of the young people's lives and let it be that way, and let us not problematize this in any manner. That would be one obvious response to some of the issues or some of the questions that Rune just brought up. But in my work as a media scholar and as the chair of the Danish Media Council for Children and Young People, I do meet now and then with parents who actually experience serious problems in relation to the way their young people play video games. They have some heavy, serious conflicts, including young people who basically just refuse to go to school, for instance. So you might talk to people who call you and say, my son has not been to school for 2 months. What can I do about it? He's apparently addicted to video games. So that's one reason why it might make sense to some degree to figure out what are the problems here? What is the sort of conflict? But not trying in advance to make necessarily the video game the reason to this problem. It's just somehow part of this problem. And one way video games can become a part of the problems, I will argue here, is when video games become parts of a broken life strategy. Before I get more into that question, I will first of all present some of the data that I base this argument on, and which Andreas and Anna has also partly based their argument on. So first of all, what we did together was a survey, a national randomized stratified survey, including 1,560 respondents, aged 10 to 18, focusing, and the survey was focusing on gameplay activities in relation to other aspects of everyday life. Moreover, in order to address this very concept of, problem, the problem part of this, we also included a range of measures of, welfare or lack of welfare. So rather than trying to measure addiction, Rune has just told us why this is a problem, we would rather focus on, for instance, bullying, loneliness, domestic conflict, and physical symptoms of lack of welfare, such as headaches, stomach aches, sleeplessness, and so on. What we found was, just to begin with, not much really. At least in relation to lack of will. We didn't really find any strong correlation between different gameplay patterns and lack of will. Actually, if we look solely at lack of will as a physical symptom, we could see that the more you play, in particular competitive team play, the better you seem to be in your everyday life. One obvious reason for that is probably that we have more boys among the competitive team players. And the boys seems to be doing better in general, whereas it seems to be in general the girl who show a greater lack of will if we look at other surveys dealing with school children in Denmark. But what we did see was an interesting correlation between specific gameplay patterns, including games as competitive team play, that is, those who played often in teams and often against others, would play during more time slots during the day, and they would also have more conflicts with their parents about this. Whereas those never playing with others and never in against others and never in teams would play less and have less conflicts with their parents. So that was one basic finding that led us to talk about gameplay activity as belonging to different strands or different practices in everyday life. On one hand, you could see gameplay as a focused interaction. Something you do to hang out with friends, something you do to stay in touch with friends, and something that is organizing your way of being with friends. And on the other hand, gameplay as an individual pastime, something you do on your own, something you do to divert yourself. In the first case, video gameplay is in competition, so to say, with playing football or doing other types of focused interaction with your peers. In the other case, video gameplay is probably more in competition with sitting down alone and watching television or opening a book. So first of all, in order to analyze the problems related to gameplay in everyday life, it was important to understand in what ways video gameplay become part of everyday life. This led us to focus in our follow-up interviews primarily on the different gameplay patterns and how they were distributed across gender. You know, we would really like to have had an equal amount of boys and girls playing solo play and competitive team play, but that didn't turn out to be possible because it was really difficult to find female competitive team players. But we did actually manage to find a few female competitive team players, as well as a lot of girls playing video games for individual diversion, and also boys within the same gameplay patterns to sort of, you know, explore what this was all about. And on top of that, we decided to conduct 2 focus group interviews with teenage boys and teenage girls to bring the discussion to the group level, that is, in the social groups that these young people are part of. How do they talk about video games? How does it become part of their social interaction? So I did spend some time on this basic explanation of the study because this is the data that Andreas will build his presentation on, and Anne will build her presentation on as well. Because basically what this led us to understand was, on one hand, that these young people, depending on whether they have gameplay as a focused interaction and a way of being with peers or a way of being on their own, it does have different type of roles in their everyday life, and it does lead to different type of conflicts that are more or less visible in everyday life. And obviously, this leads to some amount of, you know, institutional role conflict that Andreas will talk about, and generation conflict that Anne will talk about. But what I'm going to talk about here is actually a third possible perspective, which is the way this type of gameplay in particular tends to become a type of, you know, broken life strategy in the lives of some of those young people that we have interviewed. And in order to explain this a bit further, I will have to introduce a sociological framework, which is Margaret Archer's idea about agential reflexivity. Basically, Archer is a critique of structuration theory, which is Giddens' idea that structure and actor are mutually constituting. She says, well, in order to at least understand this basic assumption, we will have to understand in which way agents, by way of their reflexivity, manages to turn a space of possibilities given by their structure into a successful life strategy or practice in everyday life. So a few key terms from Archer's framework would be worth mentioning here. First of all, the reflexive imperative. One basic thing Archer says that this, this challenge of actually turning the space of possibilities you have in front of you into one successful life strategy is greater than ever. So back in the old days, you could more or less just follow what your father did without making great life choices. But today you have to spend a lot of time thinking strategically about how you turn your possibilities into a life strategy. So in that way, in order to understand the life projects and practices of people, we will have to understand in what ways they do this. And in doing that, she distinguishes between different types of reflexivities, different ways of dealing in reflexive manners with the space of possibilities in front of you. And in doing that, she also talks about those individuals who are basically not able to. On one hand, because they are basically just too immature, they haven't learned that yet, or they are fractured, so that which is impeded reflexives, or they might be fractured. They might basically be in a sort of life crisis, preventing them from thinking in rational manners about their own life. So if we try to apply this theoretical framework to problem gaming, we can interpret problem gaming as a problem of youth, a life crisis that you might have to get through from the point in life where you are a child to the point in life where you are a grown-up who is taking the main decisions in your own life. And problem gaming may, from that perspective, be one in many ways in which young adults choose to become inactive, choose to not making those decisions. So in that way, problem gaming as an impeded type of reflexivity could look a bit like this, Oh, what's his name in English? I forgot. Calvin, with his tiger growing over the head of his mom, still insisting on wearing the same clothes and, taking his teddy around. So this would be one way of understanding problem gaming, basically as a way of staying in a life phase rather than moving on. And I have two case studies in my chapter that sort of illustrates this kind of problem. One is Rune, not that Rune, another Rune, who is living at home, going to 10th grade, which is a sort of, class you take after mandatory school when you still have not made up your mind with regard to where you want to go. He plays a lot of World of Warcraft, and he does that with friends from his old school. He really hasn't been able yet to make contacts with friends in his new school. He has an ongoing and very serious conflict with his parents about his ideas about the future. So what they are discussing is actually whether becoming a YouTuber is a viable plan for the future, or whether he should choose something more realistic. On the other hand, we have Thomas. His parents are just divorced, and he is going to a sort of, I don't know the name of that in English, EWX, sort of, preparatory education for university studies, which is sort of, traditional, like lycée in French, and high school in, I think high school, right? In English, yes. So he seems to be at another educational stage, and moreover, while playing a lot of League of Legends. He does that as a way of, gaining ground in a new group of friends in his new school. I have deliberately chosen the two because both have a great amount of conflict in their everyday lives. You know, Rune actually ran away from home because of a conflict he had with his parents about video gaming, while Thomas is still mad at his dad because of that divorce. So it's both have some sort of conflicts, but it seems that gameplay plays different roles in the conflict that the two young men experience in their everyday life. So to some degree, video gameplay seems to be a way for Rune to stay where he is, to keep in touch with his old classmates and trying to avoid thinking about this great issue, what is going to happen after 10th grade. Whereas to Thomas, gameplay is part of his way of gaining ground in a new group of friends in a new school. And he has some more very clear, not more specific, but more assertive ideas, you might say, about what is going to happen in the future. So about what is going to happen in the future. So these are just my two illustrations about how this could be interpreted. But of course, since we didn't set out to test this particular framework, our study is exploratory in nature. I really don't have the data to test out some key issues about this. So there are still quite a few questions to be answered with regard to that. We might say, and I think I have to some degree made, probable, that we can see problem gaming as an aspect of impeded reflexivity, but in what way? It could be a key factor that is excessive gaming basically prevents a gentle reflexivity. I would say we can't say that because there are too many examples in our data of the opposite. Excessive gamers that do still manage to practice a gentle reflexivity. On the other hand, we can see it as a contributing factor. Excessive gaming is part of a pattern preventing a gentle reflexivity. That you end up playing so much that you forget thinking about your life. An arbitrary factor, it appears in a number of cases, but it is neither decisive nor contributing. So that it's problem gaming that keeps Rune from moving on in his life, or if it's, for instance, too much fitness or too much alcohol, is hard to say. And finally, it might be a pseudo factor. Excessive gaming is mistakenly interpreted as a genteel passivity, while it should actually be taken as the opposite. One part of data which is actually talking for the final explanation would be that Rune actually does have plans for his future. He wants to be a YouTuber. And his greatest problem, his greatest conflict is that the parents refuse to accept this a possible plan for the future. But we don't really know whether that would be a possible plan for the future and whether Rune would be in a different state if his parents were more willing to accept this as a reasonable ambition to follow, at least for a while. So that's what I had to say. I think we are almost within time, aren't we? Yes. Are there any questions to that? Nothing? Yeah?
I kind of find it hard to understand how League of Legends player, what his gameplay has to do with this conflict at all, given that it's a divorce and he has problems with his father, and it seems it's just a factor of his life that he is playing computer just as he's reading a book or walking to school.
Sure. But to Thomas, it is really, it's not reading a book. It's rather, focused interaction. It's being with friends. And the thing is that, I hope I'm, focused interaction. It's being with friends. And the thing is that, I hope I'm sorry if that wasn't clear. I take Thomas as an example of a situation where you will not find this impeded reflexivity. He's very clear about where he's going. And it's obvious that gameplay in his situation represents an active way of moving on to gaining ground in a new group of peers, where it's the opposite in Rune's case.
given the assumption
Yes.
that
So
is
it
not-
would not be two addicts, actually. It would be in the traditional sense. It would be one, alleged addict and one non-addict
that's
that they
completely
represent.
grounded on the assumption that his life choice, Rune,
Yeah.
is not a valid thing to.
Yeah, basically, if you take an all-round discussion of his everyday life situation, you will see that the role gameplay plays in his life is a way of staying in the same position rather than moving on. Welcome. Yes, more questions before we move on? So what now? Do we have a break now? Or we have a break now? A 5 minutes break before we pass on? Continue with your presentation?
For the program, it's set to continue at 14:10.
Okay, so a 15 minutes break. Are you okay with that? It's really hot, so I think it would be nice. to get some water.
should get a drink.
Yeah.
A lot of alcohol.